After looking at Web3 ecosystems across the industry, we found a number of issues with the predominant usage of idea-based funding. After reviewing existing company structures and analyzing the different approaches that could be used, we identified that open source contributor funding could be a suitable funding process that could be highly impactful over the short and long term. To jump in, there is an opportunity for Web3 ecosystems to experiment with an open source contributors funding process. Contributors would be selected and compensated to work on open source initiatives. Founding entities currently often handle the core network and infrastructure development in most Web3 ecosystems. So, a great starting point for open source contributors could be to become a supporting structure that sits on top of the founding entities. Now, this would mean that contributors would be responsible for helping with the development of protocols and software libraries. These contributors can help with improving the developer experience, the availability of protocols to integrate, and the number of smart contract utility libraries, as just a few examples. Ecosystems could also optionally encourage open source contributors to help with network and infrastructure development efforts or application development as well. This decision is ultimately up to each ecosystem. The main suggested approaches that we recommend based on our analysis so far was the adoption of time-based incentives where contributors would be paid for their time whilst contributing for the ecosystem. Individual monthly contribution logs, where the contributions made in a recent month are documented and provided as evidence to demonstrate recent contribution efforts. Contributors would be required to submit these contribution logs to be eligible for payment in the next month. And then finally, autonomous decision making. Contributors should have the full autonomy to decide on which open source initiatives they are going to be working on based on what they believe will be the most impactful for the ecosystem. Founding entities and community members can give their feedback and advice about what would be impactful to work on. However, the actual responsibility of deciding where they spend their time should be left to the contributors. If you want to read more about our analysis that supports this funding process suggestion, particularly the usage of time-based incentives and individual contribution logs, you can look at all of our analysis we've made so far at disbursement.treasuries.co. Very nice. Now, the following areas are different parts of a contributor funding process that could be executed in a number of different ways, depending on the ecosystem. So firstly, contributor information focuses on how open source contributors would share their personal and professional information, along with any of their contribution history information to be considered as a candidate. Ecosystems could collect, store, and present this information in whatever approach makes sense in the short term. For voting, voters could either be a founding entity or it could be the wider community, depending on what voting tools are available in the ecosystem at the moment. In terms of the contributors' working arrangement, contributors would be paid for their time spent working in the ecosystem. The working arrangement could be that contributors are paid for a set term length after they are selected. The term lengths could be 3, 6, or 12 months. 6 months could be a suitable starting point. And then finally, in terms of responsibility, contributors would be responsible for supporting the open source initiatives that are most likely to create high impact for the ecosystem. That could range from bug fixes, improvements to existing software, or entirely new tools and libraries. Ecosystems may optionally want to provide guidance on the types of initiatives that have already been developed so far and the ones that have been most widely requested. Next, we can go through the advantages that an open source contributor funding process could have for contributors, voters, and Web3 ecosystems more generally. For contributors, the advantages of this funding process include quick and simple participation. Contributors would submit their personal and professional information along with any contribution history to showcase their skill sets and any impact they have generated for the ecosystem. They can then be considered as a potential candidate to become a paid contributor. Contributors don't have to suggest new ideas or make financial agreements with existing teams, and instead can focus on helping with the execution of new or existing open source initiatives. Remove budgeting complexity. So contributors would work on one or many open source initiatives. The contributor doesn't need to do budget planning ahead of time for the ideas that they work on, which saves them time each time they want to work on a different idea. This removal of budget planning also helps to remove the risks of under or overcompensation due to an idea taking longer or shorter than expected. Paying contributors based on the time they work means ideas can more easily change and evolve as required due to a changing environment. This lack of budgeting requirement is also great for ideas that only take a day or a week to complete, as now they can just quickly get these done as contributors are paid for their time and don't need to constantly seek voter approval for every idea they work on. Income stability. Contributors being paid for their time means they will receive an increased amount of stability in their income. They will also have full awareness of how long they will be compensated for, as their duration of payment will be known ahead of time when they are selected as a contributor. This means contributors can spend their entire time fully focused on executing impactful ideas rather than being concerned about how much they're being paid and the issues that emerge when ideas take longer or shorter than expected. The next advantage is around flexible contribution. Contributors could work on one or multiple ideas whilst they're being compensated to work on open source initiatives. This enables a contributor to align their efforts with the initiatives that can generate the most impact for the ecosystem. This autonomy gives the contributor more responsibility and accountability to self-identify the most impactful initiatives over time that they could work on. This can ultimately help to increase the chances that they get selected again in the future as a contributor. This ability to help with the most impactful initiatives is really achieved due to the fact their incentives aren't tied to a single idea. Funding contributors directly also helps to reduce governance risks. Funding would come from the Treasury and go directly to the selected contributors. This helps to remove governance risks around having any intermediaries that might have held these assets temporarily. A small number of actors could have misused or stole those funds that were supposed to pay for contribution efforts. Instead, by paying contributors directly, the incentives are localized to each individual contributor, and the risk for each contributor is a single month's worth of compensation. Enabling contributors to work across open source initiatives can also help with increasing their depth of experience. Contributors that are working on open source initiatives across an ecosystem can help with creating an environment where these contributors could become very well informed about the different approaches that can be used to build applications and protocols. This exposure to many open source initiatives can also help with improving their awareness and understanding of what the biggest problems and opportunities are for improving the developer experience. They can then even try to resolve this with their own contribution efforts or through collaboration with other contributors and the founding entities. Finally, another advantage for contributors with this funding approach is that it inherits many of the best parts of working for tech companies. The first advantage is the simplicity of time-based incentives, which can help increase the contribution flexity and create a more collaborative environment as the incentives are attached to the efforts of a contributor and not a single idea. One advantage of an open source funding process over existing working arrangements in tech companies is that a contributor funding model can push beyond the advantages of working in tech companies by giving contributors even more autonomy over how they decide to generate impact for the ecosystem. The contributor would ultimately be their own boss and have full ownership and responsibility to generate impact and build their own reputation. Contributors will be able to work wherever and whenever they want, as long as they generate impact for the ecosystem. Contributor funding could help to give people high levels of flexibility, reputation ownership, and autonomy. Another area of opportunity is around reducing the reasons why contributors might leave these ecosystems. Some of the common reasons that people leave tech companies and companies more generally can be considered in the context of this suggested funding process. Many of the reasons that people leave have been improved upon. Firstly, for the reason of better work-life balance and burnout. Incentives can help with encouraging and rewarding contributors that work harder than others in an ecosystem. However, the actual choice of how much time a contributor is willing to use from their daily lives is fully up to them. Contributors won't have any top-down leadership that is pressuring them to work more than they want to, a problem that can happen in corporate environments. And what about the issue of relocation? Well, a contributor working for an online Web3 ecosystem can work anywhere in the world, providing that they have internet. So really, relocation should never really be an issue. In relation to a lack of career advancement and changing work interests, a contributor would self-determine what they work on based on what ideas could generate the most impact for the ecosystem, but then also based on their own interests and what areas of work have most meaning to them. Contributors would have more autonomy to ensure they are spending time on the areas of interest or professional development that they value. Next, companies sometimes can have issues around employees leaving due to a lack of meaningful work, personal values misalignment, and entrepreneurial aspirations. The outcomes that are generated in this suggested funding process would be open source and publicly available. A contributor's work could be used by an entire ecosystem and could even make impact across the globe. Open source initiatives can help to provide ample opportunity for finding meaningful work that aligns with someone's values due to the wide scope and scale of the problems that they could work on. So hopefully these issues should at least be moderately reduced as well. And finally, for management and leadership issues, no fixed management or leadership roles need to exist in Web3 ecosystems when you're using a contributor funding approach. No one will be pushing contributors to work overtime and beyond their means. If a contributor didn't enjoy working with another contributor, they would be able to move to other initiatives when they believed it made sense to do so. Next up is voters. Let's look at the advantages for voters for this suggested funding process. The first important advantage is that voting for contributors is faster and simpler than idea selection decisions. Voters wouldn't need to compare and vote on a number of open source ideas that they might not understand or have enough context for. Instead, they can focus on reviewing the competencies and experience of a number of contributors that could help with the execution of any open source initiative. The selection approach helps to reduce the complexity and time required for voters to participate in the funding process. Decreasing the time required and complexity for voters can help with increasing the amount of voter participation and scalability of this suggested funding process. Another benefit for voters is that decisions become easier over time. Priorities and ideas will naturally change and evolve over time, meaning the complexity of selecting priorities or ideas is a persistent ongoing complexity. However, quality contributors are far more consistent over a longer time period, which means that contributor selection becomes easier over time as voters become aware of the most competent and effective contributors who they can repeatedly then select to receive funding. More tools and processes that help to highlight the performance and impact that someone has generated can further improve this ease of future decision making. Easier funding decisions will help with improving the scalability of this suggested funding process. Finally, another factor that is important is that the community is able to give feedback to the ideas that contributors are working on. Selecting contributors instead of ideas doesn't mean the voters won't have their voices heard when ideas are being created and selected for execution. Any process for creating and selecting ideas can be made fully public and invite the entire community to offer their preferences and opinions. The key difference with open source contributor funding is it would be the contributors who have the responsibility to select the most promising ideas and respond to any community engagement and feedback. Contributors are paid for their contribution time, meaning they can work on any idea during that time period that looks like it's going to be the most impactful for the ecosystem. The contributor is incentivized to respond to community feedback and work on impactful ideas, as if they don't, they might not get selected again in future funding decisions. To wrap up the advantages of this suggested funding process, let's talk more broadly about how it could benefit Web3 ecosystems. The first advantage is this funding process would mean assets get distributed more efficiently. This is because any assets that get dispersed would be actively used to generate contribution outcomes for the ecosystem, as they would only be distributed to pay for recent contribution efforts. Contributors would also only be eligible for future payment upon the submission of a previous monthly contribution log that demonstrates their contributions. This reduces the potential risks of assets sitting idle that can occur when overfunded ideas, where assets might not be used immediately to support contribution efforts that can generate impact for the ecosystem. This funding process can also help with creating an environment where contributors become highly skilled over time. Contributors would be able to work across one or many open source initiatives that could generate impact for the ecosystem. This exposure to many problems and applications across the ecosystem can help with providing contributors a lot more context and deeper understanding on what's working and what needs improvement across the ecosystem. Another skill set you help to enable is the ability for contributors to self-identify where they can generate the most impact. The contributors who can master this skill of prioritization the most effectively should have a better chance of being reselected again in the future funding decisions. They could also be paid increasing amounts of bonus incentives over time as the ecosystem grows, which would align the incentives with contributors that generate the most impact. Open source contributors can be a great solution for improving the developer experience over time. Open source initiatives can help with speeding up existing and future teams in developing their own solutions due to new software libraries and useful reference source code. Any developer experience improvements could have a large impact on the development of applications across the ecosystem. The faster and cheaper it becomes to build applications, the more it can encourage people to build solutions, or it could encourage more investment into the ecosystem to experiment with new use cases and opportunities. Open source contributors could directly support these teams in understanding and applying the different libraries and tools that exist across the ecosystem. This could help them to improve their own solutions. Open source software helps to create a flywheel of making it easier and easier to develop applications and protocols that are increasingly complex over time. Collaboration is another area that open source contributors could help with. Open source contributors will help to develop new open source software, but they can also help existing teams with building their own open source solutions. If contributors are available to help different projects, there's an increased opportunity for collaboration to emerge across these projects when shared problems are identified. Solutions that can help with addressing these shared problems can be more easily identified by contributors who are supporting many projects. These intersecting software solutions could be extremely useful for speeding up the development of ecosystem projects. Contributors can be seen as a collaborative glue that helps to bring together the ecosystem to more easily identify the most important shared problems that these contributors could then address. Increasing the amount of collaboration can help with reducing the amount of duplicated efforts and outcomes that would have likely occurred if these contributors weren't available to help with developing these different open source solutions. An important area that open source contributors could help with is better incentivizing projects in an ecosystem to open source their software. Open source contributors should have a policy that they are only allowed to work on open source software. This simple policy helps to create a positive reinforcing incentive for projects in an ecosystem to open source their code. A project with only a few developers could have immediate access to the support of numerous open source contributors that can help with their project's development if they choose to open source. Projects that decide to not open source their code would need to compete with projects that do, which could give them a serious disadvantage. This simple incentive could lead to a growing percentage of projects that open source their code from the start of their project rather than years down the line. The development speed of the entire ecosystem could be increased due to this compounding effect of having access to lots of open source code as a learning resource for other projects. And now, a final advantage with open source contributors is how it can help with reducing certain game theory risks. Contributors would state what their expected salary is when working as an open source contributor. There is a large amount of data available online that helps to show what the lower and upper ranges are for different roles and skill sets. This makes it much more difficult for a contributor candidate to exaggerate the amount of funding they should expect based on the evidence they provide. This approach can help to prevent the issues that can exist with idea-based proposals, where the amount of time they say it will take is exaggerated. The exaggerated idea cost problem is far more difficult to disprove without reviewing each of those ideas separately in more depth. Hopefully, we've gone into enough detail about why we think an open source contributor funding process is such a promising approach to support and improve any Web3 ecosystem effectively over the short and long term. Now let's think about the future potential of this funding approach. First of all, self-sovereign identity is an important growing technology that can help people with taking control over their identity and data. Open source contributors could be a fantastic approach for increasing the adoption of this technology. Credentials could initially just be used to provide proof that a contributor has been selected in the funding process to become a funded open source contributor. That simple credential could be used for a number of governance-related decisions between contributors or for execution decisions. Credentials can also be useful for recording contribution history, impact and performance, education and skills, and any peer-to-peer attestations that help with building up a contributor's reputation. Credentials could help with providing more evidence about the contributions and impact that each contributor has helped to generate the ecosystem. Potential contributors could also start to build up their reputation at any time, which would then help them with getting selected in future contributor funding decisions. If these types of credentials help to increase the chance that someone becomes a funded contributor in the future, then there is an increasing reason for contributors to adopt and utilize this technology. Funding open source contributors could help with creating a bottoms-up approach for adopting self-sovereign identity solutions that can scale to handle a growing amount of contributors over time. Another exciting area worth ongoing thought is the measuring of impact that each contributor generates and their overall performance. Improving the ecosystem's ability to better record and understand which contributors have been the most performant or that have helped to generate the most impact can help with making future funding decisions easier. The top performers could be paid bonus incentives for their contribution efforts, which would help to better align incentives by rewarding the best performers. If performance and impact can be more accurately measured, there is an opportunity to explore the use of algorithmic based solutions that help with suggesting what bonus or compensation each contributor could be paid based on the evidence of the contribution history and the amount of impact they are generating. Paying people for their time is not a novel concept. However, an open source contributor funding process could become an evolution of the existing employment model that is adopted across most companies today. Open source contributors inherit many of the benefits that these previous working arrangements have, but then go further by giving contributors more flexibility, autonomy, and self-ownership of their career trajectory and reputation. Contributors would be their own boss and would decide themselves who they work with and what they work on. A good contributor funding process could enable contributors to more freely move around ecosystems based on a provable reputation and be paid what they're worth based on their contribution history, performance, and impact. The tools and processes developed whilst experimenting and building out this funding process could ultimately change how people work in these emerging ecosystems. Trying to fix open source funding has been a growing problem for a number of years. Many open source libraries have become vital solutions and pieces of infrastructure for many large companies and widely used systems. Getting sufficient funding to pay for the contribution efforts that are needed to develop these software solutions has been an ongoing problem. Web3 ecosystems have an opportunity to fix open source funding. Funding contributors directly to work on open source initiatives is one way that this problem could be solved. Contributor compensation could eventually achieve similar or higher levels of compensation than comparative roles in large tech companies, as Web3 ecosystems grow and require highly skilled professionals. And to finish off, this suggested funding process has the opportunity to replace the founding entity structures. Founding entities are hopefully looking to give up the control and development of the network and give this stewardship and responsibility over to the community. The community should ideally have some way to influence who is paid to help improve and maintain the network. Achieving this will mean making the network more decentralized, which would mean fulfilling the original intentions of these ecosystems, where these networks should be governed by the people that use them. The open source contributor funding process could help achieve this outcome as it provides a way for voters to fund contributors that can maintain and improve the network. This process could also help with reducing the potential issues of a single actor or small group of individuals from having excessive amounts of control and influence over the network. Once this funding process matures, the employees inside the existing founding entities could start to migrate to working for the ecosystem through the open source contributor funding process. Open source contributors have the potential to help with many different responsibilities. Supporting protocol and software library development is a great place to start. However, as this funding process starts to mature, there's also an opportunity to expand the responsibilities to also include the network and infrastructure development, application development, and ecosystem initiatives. If this contributor funding process proves to be effective, it could even become one of the most adopted and effective funding processes for Web3 ecosystems. The analysis so far helps to suggest that it also could be far more effective than many of the idea funding approaches that we see today. The only way that we're going to find out how impactful this suggested funding process is will be to run some experiments and to look at the results. That's all for this video. The information covered in this video is available at contributors.org. I'm eager to talk about anything that was covered in this video if you have any feedback at all. We're also looking to help with facilitating any contributor funding experiments that are happening across the industry. Our website is linked in the description, which has our contact details if you'd like to reach out to us. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.